Hey, so my name is Brady Liss, and I am a graduate student at the University of California, San Diego, where my advisor is Tom Levy. And today I'm going to be presenting on the recent excavations at Khurbat al and how it helped inform our understandings of the Iron Age industrial landscape in Feinan. Before I get started, I just want to thank the conference organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk today. It's really a privilege to be on schedule with all these scholars, so I appreciate it. And with that, we'll get started. Okay, so just to get ourselves oriented spatially, here's a map of Feinan with the major Iron Age sites labeled. Kind of in the top center there, you can see Khurbat al-Nahas, the famous Iron Age smelting center. And just 2 to 3 kilometers to the north of Khurbat al-Nahas is Khurbat al in the red circle. And that is the main site that I will be talking about today. Some background about the site, and just really quick, I will probably go back and forth between calling it Khurbat al and just CAJ for short, so bear with me on that. It is an Iron Age copper smelting site. As you can see by the accumulations of slag on the site's surface. In the photo on the right, you can see those black heaps. Andreas Hauptmann estimated that there's roughly 15 to 20,000 tons of copper slag at the site. And between the slag and the architectural collapse, the site covers an area of about 4.8 hectares. It actually extends on both sides of the wadi. This photo just shows the eastern and more dense part of the site. There has been a fair amount of archaeological research at the site. It was first reported by H.H. Kitchener during his explorations of the region in 1884. CAJ was then surveyed by Nelson Glick in the 1930s. He also mapped the site and attributed it to the early Iron Age based on ceramic typology. As mentioned, Andreas Hauptmann and the team from the German Mining Museum surveyed the site as part of their geological and archaeometallurgical surveys in Feinan. And he also surveyed or dated the site to the Iron Age based on the technical ceramics, such as tuyere pipes and a couple of radiocarbon dates. Finally, in 2002, Tom Levy and the Jabal Fidan project surveyed the site and provided the first topographical map of the site and an updated architectural map. CAJ has also been excavated for 2 seasons, both by the Edom Lowlands Regional Archaeology Project, or ELRAP for short, directed by Tom Levy and Mohammed Najjar. It was first excavated in 2006 and then again in 2014. We will briefly look at the 2006 excavations and then move on to the main focus of the talk, which is the 2014 excavations. Here's a recent map of the site that was produced in 2014 as part of the project, just to see where the different excavation areas are. You can see area A in the kind of southwest portion of the site on top of the slag mound. That is the 2006 excavations. And then in 2014, 2 new excavation areas were opened. Area B, which was a stone structure kind of in the center of the site. You can see it kind of dead center of the map here. And then area C, which was a slag mound probe on the southeastern edge of the site. So starting with the 2006 excavations, as mentioned, this was an ELRAP project directed by Tom Levy and Mohammed Najjar, and Dr. Erez Ben Yosef functioned as the field supervisor. The excavations included a small structure and a slag mound probe. You can see both of these in the photo on the right. The structure was delineated and excavated down to a habitation surface, but its exact function wasn't exactly clear. And the slag mound probe was excavated down to bedrock, giving a record of metallurgical production in this part of the site. The project also collected 9 radiocarbon dates and some slag samples for a geomagnetic archaeointensity study. I just want to look a bit closer at the slag mound excavation briefly and point out that directly above the bedrock, the reddish soil at the bottom of the section here was a thin accumulation of crushed slag right here in red. It was 5 to 10 centimeters thick, and this provided evidence that the site was producing copper, basically right from the outset, although perhaps on a small scale, given that it's just a thin accumulation. But over time, this scale of production increased based on this thicker accumulation of slag at the surface of the excavation. And we will compare this to the 2014 results, so just keep this in mind. Here are some of the interpretations based on those excavations and the radiocarbon dates. So based on technical ceramics, the geomagnetism, and the radiocarbon, the site was dated to the 11th and 10th centuries BCE. With this dating in mind, it was suggested that the site was probably established shortly after the late Bronze Age collapse to capitalize on some of the economic opportunities created by this collapse and the disconnect with Cyprus, which was formerly providing copper to the region. It seems that at first the site may have been producing copper on a more opportunistic level based on the thin accumulation of slag. There was also some potential tent post holes found in the slag mound excavation, leading the excavators to believe maybe it was a more ephemeral occupation at first, and then later architecture was developed and built at the site. And then based on the site being dated to the 10th century, its abandonment, this was attributed potentially to the campaigns of Shashank I, prior to the peak of production at Kerber and Nahas. So the 2006 excavations were really critical in establishing our initial understandings of the site, but they were somewhat small excavations. So in 2014, the ELRAP team returned to Khirbet, Algeria, with myself and my colleague Matt Howland functioning as field supervisors. And again, we excavated Area B, which was the largest visible structure on the site, on the surface of the site, excuse me, and then Area C, the slag mound probe in the southeastern edge there. We had 4 kind of main goals moving into the 2014 excavation season. The first was to investigate the social dynamics and control of copper production at the site. And this is why we investigated this large kind of centrally located structure. We also wanted to further investigate metal production and the history of metallurgy at the site. So we included the slag mound probe. We were also interested in possible food and fuel sources that were available at the time, given the climate and environment of Fainan. So we also used a rigorous archaeobotanical sampling strategy, which included sieving all excavated sediment and also collecting at least one flotation sample from every excavated locus. And then finally, we also wanted to remap the site since it hadn't been mapped since 2006. And at that time, ground methods were used. So we used the ELRAP balloon aerial photography system to remap the site. And that is the map we have seen on the previous slides. So starting with the Area B excavation, this is an aerial photograph of the building prior to excavation. It actually seemed to be 2 separate buildings that were perhaps related, but separated by a central alley. So we only excavated the northern half, roughly in the red square here. And I'll just mention that the circular structures outlined with the dotted white lines in the bottom right of the photo are probably just some modern repurposing of the stones. So this is that northern half of the structure at the completion of excavation. We identified a building that was roughly 7.5 by 7.5 meters with entrances on its southern wall. We identified 7 potential rooms. We did not finish excavating that eastern half of the building, so that's why there's question marks on those rooms. The organization was a little bit more difficult to identify, but 7 potential rooms. Here's another angle of the building, and in this image you can see in this main central room, there's this interesting grinding installation. We will come back to that in a second. And there's also a thin accumulation of crushed slag, potentially functioning as a surface just above that grinding installation. In general, the material culture excavated throughout the building was abundant in stone tools, including grinding stones and hammer stones, and just 2 representative pictures at the bottom of the slide here. So here's another picture of this grinding feature or installation. The grinding and handstone both appeared to be very finely made, and interestingly, they were separated from the rest of the building by this standing stone slab here, kind of standing on its side. It does seem like potentially directly on the other side of this stone slab was a bedrock mortar for crushing slag potentially. There's also a hammerstone associated with it. You can see both of these just at the north arrow there. And then again, at the top of the picture, you can see this accumulation of crushed slag that was potentially functioning as a surface. We did find some ceramics throughout the building. This will be the focus of Matt Howland's dissertation. He's doing both typology and petrography, and he's working on publications on that. So I'm not going to get into that really here. Concerning the function of the building, we have some general ideas. Given the large accumulation of stone tools and the centrally located grinding feature, we hypothesize that maybe it served at least some industrial function. The grinding feature is also adjacent to crushed slag and this bedrock mortar, so potentially connected to the slag crushing process. There are some indications from the ceramic assemblage that it might have an elite function as well, maybe some elite metallurgists, but I will defer to Matt on that. issue. It's worth just noting that directly to the north of the building, there are also some mounds of crushed slag and bedrock mortars. Here we just have some pictures, some examples. Again, maybe this reiterates some sort of connection between the building and the slag crushing process. One final point about the building is that at some point it was architecturally restructured. Here we are looking at that eastern half. And if you look here, we can see that at some point the entryways to this part of the building were intentionally blocked, and these blockages went all the way down to the bedrock. And because of this, we believe that this building actually had two occupation phases, one before and one after these blockages, both of which probably used the bedrock as a habitation surface. We also collected 7 radiocarbon samples from the building, including 3 from this bedrock surface. In general, the dates fall between the late 11th to 10th centuries BCE, but we do think it's important to consider the stratigraphy with the radiocarbon dates. Again, because we have these blocked doorways that suggest this second occupation, we believe that anything that was excavated from the bedrock surface should be considered associated with this second occupation phase after the doorways were blocked. This would mean in turn that the radiocarbon dates are also from that second occupation phase, and that the original occupation and construction of the building should actually predate those radiocarbon dates. So because of this, we suggest that the building was probably actually constructed in the mid-11th during this first occupation phase. And this does give some evidence of early and somewhat substantial stone architecture at the site. Moving on to the slag mound excavation, we selected this slag mound on the southeastern edge of the site, partially because it had already been damaged by a modern road. You can see this in the picture on the left with the road in the top left corner there. And we just did a small 1 by 1 meter probe into the slag mound. You can see this in the picture on the right. Just to summarize the excavation results, we identified 3 main layers above bedrock. Immediately above the bedrock was a pretty thick accumulation of crushed slag, almost 80 centimeters thick. This transitioned into a more kind of domestic or habitation phase, which lacked slag altogether, but had more domestic refuse. And then on top of this was another thick accumulation of slag, which had not been crushed and included some larger slag cakes. I do want to compare the 2 slag mounds from Area C and Area A briefly. Overall, the stratigraphy was fairly similar: crushed slag above bedrock, some domestic and habitation refuse, and then a thick accumulation of slag in the surface layer. But where they differ is in this initial layer of crushed slag. As I had mentioned, this was somewhat thin at Area A with 5 to 10 centimeters of crushed slag, whereas in Area C, we had almost 80 centimeters of crushed slag directly on bedrock. So we believe that this suggests the site was producing fairly substantial copper immediately from its establishment. I will also just briefly mention that during the excavation of the slag mound in this kind of habitation layer, we did find a large collection of charred date palm seeds. You can see those on the photo on the left, and we will come back to that as well shortly. We collected 3 radiocarbon samples from the slag mound excavation, 1 from each of the identified layers that I mentioned. Generally, the dates fit with the mid-11th to 10th centuries BCE, with that bottom thick accumulation of slag, crushed slag, being in the mid-11th. This then fits with the idea that that stone structure was also constructed in the mid-11th century BCE, suggesting that this site had a fairly rapid establishment from its outset, with immediate large-scale copper production and a stone large structure. Along with the radiocarbon dates, we also did an archaeobotanical analysis. This study was largely done by Dr. Britta Lorentzen. She analyzed the wood charcoal that was collected during dry sieving in the field. She analyzed over 3,300 fragments, 90% of which were identified. This analysis is ongoing, and a larger study is in the works based on the macrobotanicals and the flotation samples. The chart on the right side are the results of this kind of first preliminary study. We don't need to get into the details here, but I'll just mention that all the taxa highlighted in yellow are fruit trees that produce edible fruit. This includes date palm, as I already mentioned, as well as carob, fig, grape, olive, and pomegranate. These fruits were identified both by fruit remains like pits and seeds, but also the wood from the trees, suggesting that the inhabitants of Kaj had access to cultivated fruit trees and they were consuming these fruits. And it is important to keep in mind that the terrain around Kaj is pretty rugged. So it doesn't seem like they were probably growing these trees immediately around the site. We will come back to this issue shortly. So based on the 2014 excavations, we have some initial results and interpretations. We suggest the largest visible stone structure at the site was likely constructed in the mid-11th BCE, possibly some industrial function with elite connections. The site was probably producing significant copper right away based on this thick accumulation of slag dating to the mid-11th as well. Together, these suggest the site had a pretty rapid development and establishment as a substantial copper smelting center, and the inhabitants also had access to fruits and fruit trees. These insights are fairly important on their own, but we do think they become even more significant when you situate Kaj in the larger Fainan context, in particular, sites like Khirbet el Nahas and Khirbet el Gueba. So just to briefly mention Khirbet el Nahas, which has been talked about in other talks during the conference, it is kind of the main copper smelting center during the Iron Age. You can see an aerial photo of the site here and its significant slag mounds. But critically, it was dated to the 12th, perhaps even the late 13th century to the 9th century BCE. So it actually predates Kaj. It was already producing copper when Kaj was established. So based on this, we think that Kaj was probably an expansion of this existing industry at Ken. This would also help explain how Kaj experienced this more rapid development. If there's already an industry in place, this was just an expansion of that industry, and it was established quickly as a large-scale smelting center. And if we look at the map of these sites, this also helps contribute to this picture. Here we have Khirbet el Nahas and Kaj circled in red. And if we look at the distribution of the mines, we can see that Khirbet al Juria is located much closer to a large ore body at the Wadi al Juria mines in particular. So perhaps the site was established as this kind of satellite smelting center with easier access to these mines as an extension from Khirbet el Nahas. The second site that I want to mention is Khirbet al Gueba. This is also an Iron Age smelting site. It was briefly excavated in 2009, also by the ELRAP. There is some slag there, but it's small accumulations, mostly probably small scale production of copper. It was dated to the 11th and 10th centuries BCE by some radiocarbon dates and ceramics. And the archaeometallurgical assemblage was similar to Kaj, suggesting that there is some overlap between these sites. But most important here is the site is also located adjacent a perennial spring, Ain el Gueba, and this spring affords enough water to grow fruit trees. This is evidenced by modern orchards being grown there today. You can see this in the photo on the right, the greenery around the site. This is just a larger version of that same image. So based on the charcoal evidence at Kaj suggesting they had access to fruits and fruit trees, we suggest that they could have been coming from Ain el Gueba and Khirbet al Gueba. Perhaps they were also growing orchards there in the Iron Age. And maybe Khirbet al Gueba functioned as some sort of control over these orchards and the spring, along with some of its small scale copper production. And again, if we look at the map, and now we have Khirbet al Gueba circled in red as well, we can see all three sites are located fairly close together, and they also are interconnected by these wadis. So movement between the sites would have been pretty easy along the wadis. So Khirbet al Gueba could have been functioning as a sort of provisioning site, providing fuel from the fruit trees and the fruits, and also potentially water from the spring. So if we take this all together, based on the 2014 excavations at Kaj, I think we have a better understanding of the development of an industrial landscape in Iron Age Fainan. So we believe that this Iron Age industry began at Khirbet el Nahas, and then Kaj was kind of quickly developed as an expansion of this production, likely for easier access to the mines up the wadis that direction. The archaeobotanicals at Kaj create a connection with the fruits and fruit trees likely grown around Ain el Gueba. Based on this, maybe Khirbet al Gueba was functioning as a provisioning site that controlled these orchards, providing fuel, water, and provisions to the metallurgists at Kaj and Ken. Again, movement between the sites would have been facilitated by the wadis, and together they would have formed this kind of regional network of copper production and provisioning. And then lastly, this might provide some additional insight to the development of an Edomite polity with this organization of a regional system developing in the early Iron Age. I just want to finish with some acknowledgements. Everyone listed here made this research possible. I could not have done it without them. And also my email address is listed there. If anyone has any questions, you can definitely email me. And thank you very much for listening.